When you think of Middle Eastern pastries, baklava is probably what comes to mind. But there's a whole assortment of pastries out there, including goulash, the savoury cousin of layered baklava. Here the layers of laminated phyllo pastry are separated by a savoury filling. You still get all the same great crunch and texture, but with a mouth-watering savoury flavour instead. For this recipe I've made the classic filling of ground beef and onion. You could easily make a vegetarian spinach filling or use any of your favourite recipes. If you're a fan of crispy foods, then buckle up, because this is going to be a game changer. Hey everyone, I'm Obi, a home cook who wants to get you cooking authentic and delicious Middle Eastern food. Every week I cover a new dish from the region, and I break it down so you can replicate it perfectly in your home kitchen. Consider subscribing if you'd like to see new Middle Eastern recipes every week. So goulash is very much an old school pastry that's usually served as a side dish. It's got an extremely satisfying crispy texture that's hard to beat, and it's really easy to customise with different fillings. At its core it sounds simple, just phyllo pastry surrounding a savoury filling, but there's a few steps you can follow that really take it to the next level. And if you're not a fan of working with phyllo pastry, then keep watching. I'll show you how to make a simplified version using puff pastry that is just as delicious as the original. Now let's jump right in and make it. So before we put together the goulash, we need to make a couple of components, the first of which is clarified butter, which we'll be brushing the phyllo pastry with. This keeps the layers of dough separate and gives the phyllo its distinct flakiness. You can make this quite simply by placing a 250 gram or half a pound stick of butter in a pot on high heat and melting it completely. As it melts, the fat and milk solids in the butter will separate. We want the pure fat because the milk solids can burn in the oven. Once it's fully melted, we'll leave it to boil and evaporate away any milk. After a couple of minutes of boiling, it should get really foamy and then the foam should start to break. When it reaches this really bubbly stage and you can see a completely golden liquid, the clarified butter is ready. All that's left to do now is pour it out into a glass jug to cool. As you get to the end of the clarified butter, you'll find little pieces of cooked milk solids in the pot. Try not to pour those into the jug. If you use salted butter when making this, then I'd recommend spreading a tiny bit of the cooked milk solids on some bread and trying it. It's a local delicacy in Egypt called morta and is like a really salty cheese. So next up we'll make the filling for the goulash, and the classic choice is a minced beef and onion mixture. To start, I've taken 2 medium brown onions and I'm dicing them to a fairly small size. And while I do that, let me tell you about the unofficial sponsor of this video, First Aid. Ever slice your finger accidentally while sharpening your knife or chopping something? Well, for a one-time $9.99 purchase, you can get a home first aid kit that will help you take care of most kitchen injuries. Buy it before you need it, and I guarantee it will be one of the best kitchen purchases you'll ever make. Now back to the onions, and here's what they should look like when diced. To cook the filling, we'll start by adding 2 tablespoons of olive oil to a frying pan on medium-high heat. Once the oil is heated, we'll add in the diced onion and give it a mix. Saute the onions for 2 to 3 minutes until they just start to soften, then add in 3 minced garlic cloves. Work the garlic into the onion and then saute the onions for about 5 minutes until they turn this opaque golden colour. When they reach that stage, we can add our seasonings. I'm adding 2 teaspoons of salt and half a teaspoon of black pepper. If you want, you can add other flavourings here as well, such as Bharat or Middle Eastern 7 spice. Mix it all into the onions until well combined, then push all the onions to one side of the pan. Turn the heat up to high and add in 1 kilogram or 2 pounds of minced beef. Use a spatula to spread the meat out until it fills the pan. Allow the meat to cook for about 5 minutes until it starts to brown on the underside. Then break it up into smaller pieces and flip. Let it cook for a couple of minutes and then use your spatula to break it up into smaller pieces of beef. Once it's all been chopped, mix in the cooked onions and spread out your meat mixture. Now you want to cook it until you achieve a deep brown colour on the beef. It might take a while depending on how strong your stove is. Here's what yours should look like when done. So with all that done, we can put together the goulash. I've got a 500 gram or 1 pound pack of phyllo pastry, and I'll probably use about 3/4 of it, but you can add as much as you'd like. Now it looks like my phyllo sheets are twice as big as my tray, so I'll be cutting them in half to lay them in there. This baking dish is 12 by 9 inches or 30 by 22 centimeters, and I'll start off by brushing the bottom and walls evenly with clarified butter. You need to get it in all the corners and to the top of the walls, otherwise your phyllo may stick. When done, you can lay your first phyllo sheet across the bottom of the dish. Any excess can be stuck to the walls and we'll trim it later on. Using a pastry brush, apply a thin coat of clarified butter all over the phyllo sheet, making sure to also brush any excess pastry on the walls. You'll need to go from edge to edge and get every corner of the pastry. Once the sheet has been fully coated, we can add the next layer of phyllo. Place it directly on top of the last sheet and press it down slightly to stick them together. Push out any air bubbles to make sure you get good surface contact, and once again run any excess up the walls of the dish. Now you've got 2 layers of phyllo, Just keep alternating clarified butter and phyllo until you've added about 8 to 10 layers or you've used up half of your phyllo. With the bottom layers added, it's time to trim off any excess pastry on the walls. You want to place your knife level with the base and cut through the sides. All the layers should just come off in one piece. Do the same thing on the other 3 sides as well. When you're done, you should have a clean looking base of phyllo like this. We'll brush that with another layer of clarified butter before adding the meat mixture to the dish and spreading it out into a single uniform layer. You should get it as flat as possible and get the meat all the way to the edges and the corners. Now you'll add the remaining phyllo layers the same as before. You should do another 8 to 10 layers here, but it's common to put up to twice the amount in the base. So when I had about 10 layers on, I added my final piece of phyllo. If you want really clean edges, then you have to trim the excess on the walls before you add the last layer. Otherwise the seam from the trimmed layers will show. So I just folded back the edge of my last layer and then trimmed the excess on the walls before putting it back in place. Finally, I applied one last coat of butter and then I cleaned up the edges. With it assembled, it's time to slice it into portions, and for this tray, which is 9 by 12 inches, I'm cutting it into 12 3-inch squared portions. With a ruler, I marked where I needed to cut it and got to work slicing through the dough. Now you need to make sure you cut every single layer of pastry, otherwise it will be a nightmare to serve. I did the same thing horizontally, and now I had 12 equal sized portions. Final thing to do is to make an egg wash, which will give our goulash a great shine, but more importantly it will bind the meat and pastry in place so it doesn't fall apart when serving. To do that, I added 150 ml or 2/3 of a cup of whole milk to a jug. I then added in a large egg or 2 small eggs and a pinch of salt. Give it all a thorough mix and then it's ready for use. Now just pour the mixture out evenly over your tray. Make sure to get it on all of the pieces and then give the tray a bit of a tilt so that the mixture gets thoroughly distributed. Now your goulash is ready to go into an oven preheated to 180 degrees Celsius or 350 degrees Fahrenheit to bake for about 40 minutes. Rotate it at the halfway point, and once it's browned evenly all over and the top has crisped up, it's ready to come out, and here's what mine looked like. It really is a thing of beauty, and you can see just how crispy and delicate the pastry is. Now it needs to cool so the butter can redistribute in the pastry. Once it's cooled for at least half an hour, you can serve. Just run a knife through the cuts you made earlier. Here's how the pieces looked, perfectly crispy on the top and the bottom. The layers of phyllo on the top have puffed up well, and thanks to the egg wash, the filling is held perfectly in place. I usually serve this as an appetizer when I'm throwing a dinner party, and it's always a hit. Now if phyllo pastry sounds like a bit too much work, you can make a pretty good version of this using puff pastry instead. I wanted to make it with a spinach filling, but couldn't find any in store, so I made another beef one. If you want to make the spinach filling, then check out the spinach recipe in my sambusak video. It's got sumac onions and pine nuts in it, and will be great for this dish. This time around I added in green peppers and chilies to the filling, as well as some Bharat or Middle Eastern allspice for a slightly spicier twist on the previous version. I'm using pre-rolled puff pastry here because it's infinitely easier than rolling it out myself, and I'll be doing 3 layers in this dish. Once again, you start by brushing the entire dish with butter and then laying in your puff pastry sheet, which I've already cut to size. Next you're going with half of your beef mixture and spread it out as evenly as possible. Then comes the next layer of pastry, which you'll place in there and trim the edges. The rest of the meat goes directly on top of that, and then the final layer of pastry. Finally, you cut it into portions and pour on the same egg wash from earlier, and it's ready to go into the oven. It should bake for about 40 to 50 minutes until the top layer puffs up and it looks like this. One thing to keep in mind is that the middle and bottom layer of puff pastry won't puff up because of the weight of the layers above them. The middle layer will also stay pretty soft, which actually adds a nice squishiness to the filling. If you want them to really crisp up, then just roll out the bottom 2 layers of pastry into thin layers before adding them. This is usually how I make it, and you can really fill it with anything you like. Now all that's left to do is plate it up and serve. So I had a few technical difficulties, and it's actually been a full day since I cooked this. With no further delay, let's see how they turned out. Even though this is a day old, it's so crispy and delicious to eat. Despite the filling being quite basic, it really complements the flavour of the pastry well. The phyllo pastry has really crisped up, and you can feel all the individual layers as you eat. Now it's time to try the puff pastry version. So this one tastes almost identical to the last, except for the additional peppers and chilies in the filling, and it also tastes a little lighter. Where it differs most is texturally. You do get a crunchy top layer which is puffed up, but then the middle and bottom layers are softer, which contrast well together. Give it a try and let me know which fillings you think will work well. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed the video then leave a like, share or subscribe as it really helps the channel. As usual, all the ingredient amounts and directions are in the description box below, and I'll be back next week with another recipe.